The Great Steppe, millenniums of events, hundreds of nomadic tribes and people. They lived, worked, made discoveries, conquered large tracts of lands, and left us some mysteries. To learn more about it, watch the project called Enigma of the Great Steppe. In 1921, the Civil War was over. Bolshevism won. But the situation on the sixth part of the territory was terrible. The country that survived the bloody battle, brutal requisitions, epidemics, collapse of production, banditry, and famine was in a state of collapse. The situation of Russia, Lenin wrote, reminds a man who was nearly beaten to death and who could move with crutches.
It
was a systemic crisis. A new republic, which immediately after its proclamation suffered from the fire and tragedy of the Civil War. The country was under devastation and economy was in a very poor condition. Almost 7 years it suffered from the war, i.e. 4 years, the First World War, and almost 2.5 years of civil war. And it is believed that almost 19 million people died in this situation. Trade is now called speculation and considered illegal. This was the vision of Russia of the 1920s by the writer Herbert Wells. And this is in the central cities of a huge country. And what to say about the former imperial outskirts? Basically, Kazakhstan was an agricultural country. There was lead production and some rudiments of the metallurgical industry. But it was mainly an agricultural country. The native population, the Kazakhs, were driven away from these fertile lands. These lands were given to the Cossack districts. The situation here was even more terrifying. There was the process of a surplus expropriation. As a result, in June 1921, 4 out of 5 residents of only western Kazakhstan suffered from severe hunger. The memories of descendants of people who survived in that hell break our hearts. Here is the story of my mother. They lived in the Taltygorgan region. She is from that region. 1918 to 1922 were very hard years, the years of hunger and ruin. My mother remembers how she was walking along the road and she was picked up in the steppe. People were taking children who survived. She was about 6 years old. They brought her to an orphanage. People were dying one after another. According to incomplete data, in 1922, the population of Orenburg, Kustanai, Akhtubinsk, Ural, Turgai provinces were reduced to 1/3. The situation was compounded by the movement of the starving people from the Volga region to Turkestan. Tashkent is the city of bread. It is the persistent myth of those terrible years. Love and hunger rule the world, Johann Schiller wrote in the 18th century. No one except the ardent supporters of the regime had any particular love for the Bolsheviks. But hunger threatened the collapse of the dream of the victory of communism. It is necessary to pay tribute to the Bolshevik leadership, to Lenin and Stalin, that they had tactical flexibility. In March 1921, the 10th Congress of the Congress of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, was held. On this Congress, they proclaimed the introduction of the new economic policy in the country, which is known as NEP. Lenin agreed that it was needed to reduce pressure on the peasants and it was time to reconcile with them, but not forever, for 5 to 10 years. Most of the party members believed that NEP as a forced measure was introduced only for the period of one harvest season, as a bluff for the peasantry. And this was everywhere. In June, the first Constituent Regional Party Conference in Orenburg, where 28,000 communists gathered, approved the transition to NEP. The strange thing is that in the Soviet era, when we studied history, there was only a paragraph dedicated to the history of Kazakhstan. And that's why history always seemed to be far away, something that was not related to us. NEP in the history of Kazakhstan was directly connected with the lives of our families. What did NEP mean as a political and economic phenomenon in Kazakhstan being a part of a huge country of Soviets? Where did opium money come from? Was there a NEP man, or did Novorish of Russia differ from steppe-rich people? Why was NEP doomed? What price did the women of the East pay for liberation? Or why did the Bolsheviks need orphans? How did the short respite affect the work of the Kazakh intelligentsia? NEP is not only the denationalization of industry and the permission for commodity and money relations and private enterprise, but first of all, it is the replacement of the surplus expropriation by the tax on food production. And of course, a very important step was the introduction of the monetary reform. As the fraud Papandopoulos from the comedy Wedding in Malinovka said, "Do you want 100 million? You can take them. I'll draw for myself another 100 million." In vague times, different kinds of currency were there: Kerinki and Nikolaevka, Katinka and Khorizm silk. For example, in 1918, when gangs of Basmachi cut off Verny, now Almaty, from the center, the cash flow was difficult and completely stopped later. Then locals decided to make banknotes themselves, but banknotes are printed under some kind of content. There was no wealth in the city. There was only hunger and cold around. They found an original solution. In the cellars of the banks, opium was kept, either confiscated or for medical purposes. Estimating it cost at 40 million rubles, they released opium money. On banknotes, it was written, "Provided with opium." But such financial mess could not last long. Therefore, the government introduced the famous Russian Soviet Chervonets, and it was stable currency which was under the gold provision of the Soviet government. And this Chervonets was a significant phenomenon in the economy of the Soviet government. Within the first 2 years, the food supply was restored. Fairs and shops started functioning. Fast-moving consumer goods appeared which did not exist before. People got a chance to breathe at ease. The peasants had the opportunity to exchange surpluses of their harvest for manufactured goods. People were engaged in trade also. By 1926, there were 128 fairs in Kazakhstan with a total turnover of more than 20 million rubles. Annual trade fairs in Kuyandi and Bayanaul, Atbasar, Will, Timir, and Urda had the abundance and diversity of the goods. Around the Green Bazaar, there were trading houses. Kali Ordabayev even had accounts in a Swiss bank. My aunt was educated in Paris, and she was a resident of Switzerland. She was arranging these banking operations there. So our country was not the outskirts. Auls revived. In 1925, the sown area in the Ural, Akmola, and Semipalatinsk provinces reached the level of 1913, which is considered the benchmark in the economy of Tsarist Russia. The main thing is that during the NEP years, fertile pastures were returned to their traditional owners, Kazakh cattle breeders. Imambek B was a rational man, and of course he understood that the government would confiscate his cattle, so he got rid of the cattle. He sold all of them. He had some savings, and when NEP started, he left the Jitisu region, his native village. He went to the west of Kazakhstan, to Mangalshlak, that is Mangistau. And he came back with a caravan of camels laden with salt. Salt is the most marketable product. It is always in short supply. That was his economic thinking. The industry also had good chances during NEP. The Ritter plant was launched ahead of schedule, and by 1923 it began to produce 40% lead of the amount of all over the Soviet Union. In 1920, the Shymkent's Santonin plant started its work. People began to mine black gold in the Ural-Emba fisheries. In Dosar and Makat, oil rigs started to extract oil. In 1928, the Karsakpai combine production of black copper was started. The Bolsheviks also did not forget about the goods of daily demand. I think that it was a return to common sense after war communism. Because this is the normal course of life. People need to live. Craft industry was everywhere. The textile factory started working in Orenburg. In Kustanai, the cloth factory called Stability was built. The artel of Russian Muslim blacksmiths was opened. The production of canned food in Petropavlovsk was set up. Sunflower oil of local production was supplied throughout the Soviet Union. The leather shops and fishing was developed. By 1928, there were 103 communes and 650 agricultural artels in Kazakhstan. The government removed equality in salary and introduced differentiated salary that was more effective. In fact, it is a step towards the capitalist system, towards the controlled capitalist development. A vivid example is the Kargalin cloth factory near Almaty. It was built in 1908 by the merchant Sergei Shakvorodtsov. He was a man of business and realized that it was possible to buy quality wool here for a penny. The cloth was as good as the English one. It is interesting that during the years of the Revolution and the Civil War, the poor workers continued to work and defended the factory against basmachi. And the production was on the verge of collapse. But in 1922, they were the first foremost and they were given honorary diplomas. And yet, despite all the achievements in the minds of many people, especially the older generation, the image of NEP men was a fusion of the caustic characteristics of Ilf and Petrov, Zoshchenko and Mayakovsky, Demyan Bidny and Alexei Tolstoy, and vulgar pictures from magazines. NEP men were even deprived the right to vote, and they were blamed for all sins. There were places of bourgeois entertainment all around, cafes, restaurants, gambling places, buffets with strong drinks, sweepstake, etc., waiting for the communists, especially the young, to disintegrate the party. Only Elichka, the cannibal, character of novel, means a lot. In the novel, Heart of a Dog, Polygrafich, told that he was a working class. Professor Preobrazhensky was surprised. "Are you a hard worker?" And Sharikov proudly replied, "It is known, not NEP men. What did NEP men do that the head of the removal department did not like them? And everything is simple here." We are following NEP because it serves the socialism, and when it ceases to serve the socialism, we will throw it away. Lenin said that NEP was implemented seriously and for a long time, but he never said that NEP was implemented forever. The image of Nepmen, which was formed in our republic, is of course the product of the active ideological work of the Soviet state. And first of it is Stalin's work. The Bolsheviks knew that NEP is just a transitional period. Nouveau riches were drinking, the doors of taverns slammed, champagne flowed like water in the river, and the criminal murka sounded all over the cities. Of course, the classics were of little interest to the rich people. They set their own fashion. Their main entertainment was cabaret and restaurants, but as for Kazakhstan, the situation here was a bit different. How did Nepmen of Kazakhstan spend their leisure time? There is no information about it in the literature. Or were they different from the usual caricature characters?
Естественно, это должны быть люди образованные.
Of course, they were educated people, and only quite wealthy Kazakhs could be educated. Because education was worth serious money. Only religious education was free of charge. Some primary schools were free, but not everywhere. In order to send the child to study, one must realize the necessity of this education. Of course, none of the rich people denied themselves the pleasures. However, the steppe still lived by its own laws. The most important thing is the sense of justice that always existed, and it should rule the law in general. This is the law called Zheti Zhargi. It states that justice is above the law. On the one hand, the program of the Bolsheviks included the liberation of the colonies and the rights of nations to independence. This impressed the national elite. On the other hand, it was necessary to preserve the territories within the empire. This was also an impossible task. But people who overthrew Tsarism had new thoughts and foresight, and in the quiet offices, special instructions and orders were created. After the establishment of the Kyrgyz Republic, a number of decrees were issued during 1920 to 1921. They represented an attempt to change the traditional culture of the Kazakh people radically. First of all, these were decrees against Kalim. Dowry, decrees against laws on widows and orphans, Jisir. About widows, decree on the prohibition of ransom. Jasau, dowry, wedding gifts. All these things were out of law. All these changes were against the norms of Zheti Zhargi, set of laws of Kazakh Khanate. Kazakhs have always tried to protect children and women. Levirate marriage was legal. A year after the death of her husband, the widow was to marry one of the brothers of the deceased or his relative. Thus, the widow and her children were under care. There's one saying, relatives quarrel, reconcile, but never break up. Therefore, there were no orphans in the steppe. But the Bolsheviks dealt with this. Gave a kind of freedom to women. But what was it for? First, they dispersed rich people and took their children to orphanages and brought up them like little Octoberists, pioneers with the spirit of Soviet patriotism. I have direct associations with the life of my parents. And it was NEP. In 1928, 657 rich people were evicted from auls. We do not know how many people got into the millstones of building socialism. Their children became the first, but not the last orphans. Perhaps it was a grand social experiment. No one can answer this. There is no evidence of contemporaries. The scientist Efrat Imambek explains this fact in the following way.
Это даже дети, которых НЭП мог остаться в памяти, но, увы,
People who could remember NEP are under Moscow.
был тот демографический пласт, который бросили под...
They died in 1941 and 1945.
Был просто перемолот в этой мясорубке 1941 года. Наверное, поэтому...
Probably that is why there is nothing in the people's memory. The other fact is that NEP was forgotten by the genocide and the result of Goloshokin's death after 1929. Perhaps according to the plan of the Bolsheviks, they wanted to bring up those orphans as true builders of communism with a consciousness free of obsolete dogmas and customs. This recalls the story of Janissaries, the soldiers of the Ottoman Empire of the 13th and 19th centuries. They were fearless and faithful, but they were slaves of the Sultan and lived in barracks. They had no family and no attachments. That is very strange and terrible parallel, and this is only consumption. But the class struggle is a real fact. The Kazakh society was not socially homogeneous. This is true. Of course, there were social contradictions and there were differences. And the uprising of 1916 clearly showed that there were ordinary people and there was elite, which did not share the interest of other people. The representatives of that elite who worked in the colonial administration then headed those punitive detachments, and they fought against their own people just for ranks, money, and titles. By the way, the class struggle did not stop after the revolution. Moreover, it has penetrated very deeply into creativity. The history of Magjan Zhumabayev is the confirmation of this. My people, Alash, are very slow people. I cannot explain this to others. But I am in love with my people. They are covered with mirage veil. Live in the harsh snowstorms. Winters are like shroud and summers are very hot. Having no forest, having no grove, having no mountains with water in the rivers, and having only dry, vast steppes. This is Saryarka, my homeland. I cannot explain this to others, but I am in love with my homeland. The words of the great Magjan touched the hearts, but there were people who did not believe the sincerity of the poet because of social resentment.
В этом плане показательным является роман Сакена Сейфуллина «Тернистый путь».
The novel of Saken Seyfulin, Thorny Path, is a good example here.
Показывает нам вот это наличие.
This novel demonstrates to us the presence of this social stratification inside the Kazakh elite.
И, безусловно, это
And of course, this was reflected in literature.
литературы, ну, например,
Well, for example, Tursinov and his friends were the admirers and supporters of Magjan Zhumabayev.
и сторонниками Магжана Жумабаева.
They did not really like Saken Seyfulin because Saken Seyfulin considered himself as a proletarian writer, and he considered them as sons of Bais, rich people who, together with the Tsar's government, oppressed, enslaved, and moreover, punished their own people. So class hatred flourished in creative fields also. What was the reason for the denunciation of Magjan Zhumabayev? Was it envy of talent, resentment towards his origin, or just fear for their own life? There is no answer to this question. There were other famous names behind these arrests, behind these fates. In 1929, Magjan was sent to the distant exile to Solovki, to the infamous Solovki prison camp. In the camp, Magjan studied medicine and became a medical assistant. At the petition of Maxim Gorky, the poet was released. But after 1.5 years, he was again arrested and shot like the Japanese spy. The mill of the Bolshevism grinded business people and poets ruthlessly. The age of NEP, like any tipping point, is full of tragedy and contradictions, rises and falls, genuine enthusiasm and cruel disappointments. But in 1929, the year of the Great Crisis, NEP was buried forever. Political scientists Zbigniew Brzezinski believe that years of NEP were the best years of the era after the revolution for the Soviet Union. History about this needs a detailed study. Many documents are still inaccessible, including those which are connected exclusively with the creative intelligentsia. Who knows what secrets are hidden in their broken white pages?